Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another free virtual Thursday program with the Foss Waterway Seaport. I'm your virtual guide for this evening, Chris, and tonight's virtual tour has been brought to you by the generous contribution of Columbia Bank. With that, we are off and running. Already getting some good comments here. I'm glad to see that everything sounded good out there, and please keep me posted as we go through tonight if you have questions, comments, or concerns. The often neglected third one out there. Tonight is one that I know a lot of people have been excited about. I hope that we can clear up some misconceptions and then provide you with some new information, because in the world of smuggling and rum running, Tacoma has been featured very heavily throughout U.S. history, and it is one of the major ports that just gets left out. I think specifically with Prohibition, people talk a lot about like Chicago and New York, New Jersey, and completely neglect the fact that there was a direct pipeline from Canada into the United States via Tacoma, Seattle, that was happening all the time. And luckily for us, we have a lot of that area and history really well preserved here. So let's crack a can of that open tonight and go on and do it. Looks like everyone's doing great tonight. Nice. So let's talk about some rum running in the area, shall we? When you're going through Tacoma, I think people always have a ton of questions about the tunnels. And yes, there is an expansive underground beneath the city of Tacoma. It is different in a lot of ways than the underground in Seattle. This is part of the Tacoma Underground featured here. And as Tacoma was expanding upwards from the waterfront, you know, Tacoma's on a very steep slope. And so as they were going up the hill, they essentially terraced the city. And when you would get to the uphill portion of a city block, they would create like a retaining wall on that section and then sluice or flood the upper part of the hill and let all of that sediment come down to the top of the retaining wall, and you'd have a flat street essentially. And then they'd keep building up. So you have all this underground section where they created just a terraced city. In addition to that, there are also a great deal of steam tunnels and passages that were created because all of downtown Tacoma was originally on central steam. And so they just had this infrastructure that eventually got used for things like smuggling. As Prohibition hit Washington state, and this is important, Prohibition hit Washington in 1916, 4 years before the Volstead Act became a federal thing. Washington was like, we hate it. Get rid of all the booze. And so voted proactively to enact statewide prohibition before the rest of the country even got there. And I always think that's so incredibly ironic based on where Washington is today on their sale of substances across the board. So we've changed a lot over time. But smuggling became very popular even then, and then really hit its peak in the 1920s. And then by the time Prohibition ended in 1933, there was a huge network of various illicit substances being moved around through the area. And we just couldn't get our story straight. So this is a tunnel from Pacific Avenue. It's essentially where the National Bank building is today, or sort of the Washington building, kind of down on that area of Pacific Avenue. And then this one is from the vaulted underground section, essentially at the back of the University of Washington Tacoma campus. If you were, I guess, directly underneath the Swiss or the former Swiss, that's where you would be looking for this one right here. And then some more Prohibition here. Now for us, we're really lucky because the Foss Waterway Seaport Museum is the last remaining section of what was once the world's longest grain storage warehouse. And you can see all of the ships that would just line up right here at the warehouse. They could onload, offload. And on the other side of the building, which you can't really see here, was the railroad, which would roll directly up to the back door of what is now the Seaport. And so you could do all of your trading back and forth that way. And today, it's not only a really good-looking museum with a lot of cool stuff going on, but it's documented that history over time very well. So here it is as a grain warehouse, but it also stored a few other things over time. So I want you to kind of keep this image in your mind, because when we're going through history today, it's important to know that quite a bit of stuff we very strongly believe was smuggled through the building that is now the Seaport. And as the most compelling piece of evidence, this was from the remodel in early 2000. This is an unassuming office. It was inside the Foss Seaport building there. And all of these photos are courtesy of Jan Adams, the photographer at the time who was documenting the renovation. And then as they pulled up the rug of this office room, they found this bad boy right here, which they're like, what the heck? A hatch had been cut roughly into the floor at some point in the history of this building. And then a ladder had been constructed underneath it that led directly down onto the water. And you can see that here. So if you were underneath the Seaport, depending on the tide, you would have access to this tunnel and hatch up into the Seaport building right there. And it's not exclusive to the area. This is another picture of a tunnel that still exists underneath Tacoma today. This one is actually part of a centralized steam heating tunnel, which is underneath Stadium High School. And this one was constructed for when Stadium High School was designed to be a luxury hotel for the Northern Pacific Railroad Company. And so there's this honeycomb of tunnels and passages and secret hatches all throughout Tacoma, and they all, for the most part, lead directly to places that ended up being well-known speakeasies that ended up either getting shut down or just living in infamy for the entire career. There we go. Let's get you guys going through here. Also, I talk about it all the time, but if you're not familiar with the legend of the Skoog is essentially Tacoma's Sasquatch as far as like legendary myths. There was supposed to be a speakeasy throughout all of Prohibition, and then it came back in the 1980s, and it was just some basement that had been retrofitted into a full bar, and you literally just would go to this person's house, knock on the back door with a password, and get let down into the basement. And this circle here is the alleged location of the Skoog. I've never met anyone, at least I won't confirm or deny that I have, who's ever been to the Skoog, or if it even still exists. But I think while we're talking about rum runners, prohibition, smuggling, and secret locations, it would be wrong of me to not at least bring up the Skoog. And then for those of you who are Tacoma people, you might have even remembered Pacific Brewing and Malting. They had the Dirty Skoog, a beer of theirs on tap for a long time there. That's an homage to the secret bar out there. And yeah, 100%. Stadium High School looks like a castle. Well, to give you some backstory on sort of the smuggling operation here and its connection to Tacoma, I always like to remind people about the Haitian Republic. Not the actual Haitian Republic, but the ship at the time, which was originally constructed in the 1890s. This is a picture from Saltwater People Historical Society's website. The Haitian Republic was first built as just sort of a like luxury liner, and it never caught on. It really found its purpose in the 1890s as a smuggling ship. And in 1885, the townspeople of Tacoma went down to Chinatown, which was just down on the waterfront, very close to where the Foss Waterway Museum is today. They rounded up all the Chinese nationals, forced them out of Tacoma, and then burned everything to the ground. And then within a year or two from doing that, the demand for Chinese labor and opium skyrocketed. So it became a very lucrative trade to actually start smuggling Chinese people and opium back into the Tacoma area under cover of darkness. And one of the ships that was prominent in doing that was the Haitian Republic here. And a lot of people remember this ship as the Portland. Eventually, the smuggling operation with the Haitian Republic got shut down, and the ship was confiscated and then rechristened as the Portland. And it was the major ship that ran in between Seattle and the Yukon, bringing millions and millions of dollars of gold down from the Yukon into the Seattle area, making it richer and richer every day. But originally, when this smuggling operation was happening in Tacoma in the 1890s, everyone kind of like knew about it, but no one wanted to touch it or do anything about it. And there wasn't really a dedicated agency pursuing it. The Coast Guard is what they had sort of looking at these various ships that were coming in. And then Customs and Enforcement were the agency in Tacoma that were responsible for it, but they were always turning a blind eye suspiciously. And so the editor of the Tacoma newspaper at the time wanted to do something about it. And he had one of his reporters come up from Olympia, and they staged this fight at the Tacoma newspaper office and made it look like this guy was quitting. So he storms out of the office. He's like, I'm not going to work for the newspaper anymore. And then he secretly goes up to Victoria in Canada and embeds himself in the smuggling operation and just starts asking questions, pretending that he is a smuggler until he is intertwined in this whole operation. And he gets information about things like this. So this is across from the Tacoma Public Library, and it is an alleged smuggling tunnel that they were bringing the Chinese labor force through, and they would hide them for a period of time in these tunnels and then send them out to be used as labor throughout the city of Tacoma. This reporter, Stephen DeLacy, ends up finding a series of ships that get sunk, and the Canadian exporter who was going to ship all his cargo out is looking for a new operation to get involved with. And so Stephen rolls up and is like, hey, maybe I can help you cover your losses. Tell me more about your operation. And this guy just gives him everything, gives him books, ledgers, explains the whole process to him. And he now has all the proof he needs to shut down this operation. So he comes back to Tacoma after having pretended to quit as a news reporter. He gives all this proof to the U.S. Customs Office. The newspaper does a huge write-up on it. And then they shut down this massive smuggling syndicate. And eventually DeLacy ends up becoming, if I'm not mistaken, like the head of, U.S. Deputy Collector of Customs for the Tacoma office. So he officially does quit being a reporter and then just starts shutting down smuggling operation because he had all this information. He just wormed his way into the organization and people loved talking to him. So they just gave up everything and he ends up shutting everything down. Now this picture here are of old opium tins. When the opium would get smuggled, it would get either produced in China, brought into Victoria or Vancouver, and then smuggled down into the United States, or there were some small scale operations that were producing opium up in Canada, and then they would run it down under cover of darkness into Tacoma. And this is of the Portland as well. So you can see as a smuggling vessel, it was not subtle. It was a very large, steamer vessel that belched a lot of smoke. It was very obvious. It was not very fast, and it was easy to catch. Over time, the process changed. And so when we're talking about the golden age of smuggling in Tacoma, rum running, prohibition, and on, we're looking basically at the 1890s with sort of a brief hiatus during the Roaring 20s, and then really, really hard, I guess, before the Roaring 20s. Then Volstead Act prohibition, 1920 to 1933, tremendous amounts. Early smuggling would have been done on little ships like this, little sailboats. And Lawrence Kelly is our guy. He is the king of the smugglers, the unofficial title given to him by the people throughout the Puget Sound. And man, this guy's story is bananas. So he was Irish. He born in Ireland, but grew up in the United States and then fought as a Confederate during the Civil War. And when the South lost, he wasn't having it. He was like, well, that's it. If we're not going to have the country I want, I'm never going to do a day of honest labor in this country. ever. And so he takes his 9 children and moves, or he didn't have the children yet. He moves out to the Washington area and he starts smuggling. And he was moving Chinese nationals and opium down from Canada into mostly Tacoma and some into Seattle. And he knew the Tacoma area because that was the first place he moved and worked in the lumberyard, and would just sail around the Puget Sound getting to know the area. And after he had the lay of the ocean, he would just go around under cover of darkness, sailing primarily in storms. And Lawrence had the most magnificent reputation of being a storm sailor. When the Coast Guard at the time would try and chase him and like confiscate anything that he had on board, he would just run his little tiny sloop up into shallow water and then heel it over. He would put it into the wind so that it tilted over, and he could just go through water so shallow and treacherous that the steamships that the Coast Guard were using at the time couldn't hope to follow him. Or if they did, they often ran aground or sank. Coupled with the fact that he only tried to sail when it was stormy or foggy, and he was impossible to catch until he got to port. He ends up getting arrested, I think like 12 different times over the course of his career, and imprisoned in Tacoma, Seattle, and then he served a period of time in McNeil. But true to his word, he had a code of 2 things. One, he was never going to work an honest day in his life, which was true. He smuggled for his entire career. And also that he would never commit violence again. That was another big thing for him. So he never engaged in any sort of violent smuggling or trade in the Puget Sound area, but he was a ghost of the night. This is up in just off the coast of Anacortes, where Kelly's Point is, because he actually, with all his illicit gains, bought a part of this island out there, was dubbed Smuggler Kelly by the people in the area, and for 45 years basically ran opium throughout the Puget Sound. Eventually he gets caught enough that he goes bankrupt, and then when his wife and kids disavow him and leave him forever, he ends up moving back to the South and living out his last days in poverty there. But Lawrence Kelly, king of the smugglers, still holds the reputation for being the most accomplished storm runner in the area, specifically because he did so under sail. Now, there are other smugglers and rum runners in the area that have achieved some greater fame, but if you're looking at the very beginning, especially in the Puget Sound, that's our guy. And if you go to, I'm trying to think, the Anacortes Historical Society or the Anacortes Museum's website, you can still see some of the sweet historic photographs they have, because Kelly's ships stayed in the area. I think this photo is from 1979, and it's the rotten hull of one of his sloops that he left in the area, and someone had the wherewithal to go out and document them. It was the fleet of Pirate Kelly's sloops, and they were just out there until they eventually vanished, along with all of the infrastructure that he built out on Kelly's Point. So to this day, other than the story that's left behind, no one really has any proof or recollection of this guy, except for this photograph, which is on the Saltwater People's Historical Society website, which is the only photograph I know of one of those Lawrence Kelly sloops under sail. And I think this one was taken significantly after the point. I think it was resold to someone who bought it after he ended his career of piracy and smuggling out there. But the 1920s is when really things get cruising to a massive scale out there, because now that you can't just go anywhere for a drink, and Washington State was hungry for it, the way that they were doing it was that they were either making their own in the area, which 9 times out of 10 was poison. Some of the only drinkable stuff in the area was a blackberry cordial made down in the gulches of Tacoma by the Croatian population here. But for the most part, any of the whiskey or gin that was being made in illegal stills in the basements or like tunnels that people dug around the area was undrinkable swill. So the best way to get a good drink in the area was to import illegally fine Canadian whiskey. And so Victoria and Vancouver become these major hubs where these massive export organizations would store whiskey and then find a buyer out in the area, and then it would get smuggled, rum run through the night into Seattle and Tacoma. And perhaps one of the most famous of these gentlemen was Seattle's gentleman bootlegger, Roy Olmsted. Now, Roy Olmsted had been a cop. He was an officer who gets dismissed from the police force in 1920 after he's arrested at Meadowdale Beach in a huge liquor bust. So he's like, well, screw it. I will just go and be quote unquote legit as a bootlegger instead of a cop. And he becomes, there's so many kings here, the king of the Puget Sound bootleggers. And this is what's really wild, is when you look at the like violence and murder of East Coast bootleggers, you don't see any of that in the Puget Sound. They would have like conferences together. They would get together, talk about like settling the truce or keeping the peace in the area. And so there was very little, if any, smuggler on smuggler violence. They all sort of had an understanding with one another and sort of just benefited from maintaining a network throughout the area. And it got broken down into the bootleggers, the people like Olmsted here who are actually running the liquor through the area, either in Seattle or Tacoma, the speakeasies where it was actually being sold, and then the rum runners, who are, in my opinion, the coolest, because their job was just to transport the alcohol from Canada to the various cities throughout the Puget Sound. And they were notorious for doing it at night, in the fog, during storms, in boats that were painted black with no lights. And the evolution of these boats is, for me, one of the most fascinating parts of this whole thing. So Olmsted here sets up his operation. This is him and his wife. And his wife, Elise, allegedly, they've never been able to prove it, but sent coded messages to all the rum runners in the area, because this is their living room in 1924, had the Aunt Vivian show where Elise would read bedtime stories to kids, and the Olmsteds had their own radio station. So they would broadcast nightly, and it was all just like wholesome, folksy family stuff. And Elise would always read the bedtime stories at night. But people were convinced that she was sending these coded messages out to people, giving them updates on the Coast Guard, customs, and police operations out there, which they stayed up to date on because Roy was a cop for so long. A lot of the police in the area were more inclined to trust him than the federal agencies that were coming in trying to catch them. Also, just a quick side note for you guys on this whole thing, because I love it. You should know this woman. This is Elizabeth Friedman. And in 1923, she was hired by the U.S. Navy to lead their cryptology program, essentially. So she's a cryptoanalyst who came out of, I think, Indiana, and was so good at deciphering coded messages that the Navy was like, for sure, we need you on our team. And she is responsible for more busts of bootleggers and rum runners than probably any other single figure in the history of American Prohibition. She, I think, ended her career in the late 1940s, where she was still testifying at trials of people who were just getting mopped up from smuggling stuff. But anytime people tried to send coded messages, she would get brought in as a specialist, and she would crack the code right out the gate. And so she was an expert witness for a lot of testimonies, putting people away. And she operated very briefly here in the Puget Sound at the end, getting rid of decoded messages and figuring out the operation of smugglers in the area. She got here after the Olmsted transmissions were happening, so she wasn't a part of that whole thing. But most of that had been busted up pretty well by that point anyhow. For those of you familiar with the Seattle area, Doc Hamilton's was one of the speakeasies that sold Olmsted fine Canadian liquor. It was brought into the area and then sold throughout that area there. For Tacoma, though, we didn't have a Roy Olmsted. We had Pete Marinoff. Now, this photo comes from the Coast Guard Museum up in Seattle. And Marinoff was the top bootlegger for the Tacoma area. He was the boss of everything. And he had a reputation for only doing booze. It was his code. He never got into opium, narcotics, prostitution, gambling. The only thing he did was booze, and he stuck to that. And so not just other smugglers in the area, but like even the police called him Legitimate Pete, because he only would stick to the one thing and never dabbled in other illegal activities. He, in the Tacoma area, had a fleet, a small armada of 7 speedboats that he used to smuggle Canadian liquor down into the Tacoma market. And originally, he would sail his own vessels. This is him on his flagship here, the Alice. And Pete, despite being legitimate, wasn't necessarily the best at rum running and would frequently get caught. And his big move was to just dump stuff overboard. Like if it looked like the Coast Guard was going to get him, he would just chuck it. And what really put him away for the longest period of time was that one time the Coast Guard boarded his vessel thinking that he was smuggling, couldn't find anything. But the captain of the Coast Guard in charge of that particular run was like, I'm bringing you in and we're going to write you up for your lights because you have the wrong lights on your vessel. And honestly, I don't think you have a single fire extinguisher on here. And so gives them all these trumped up citations. They tow him into Tacoma. And when they get there, they find that he had a cache of liquor that had been weighted down and attached to the end of a line that he was towing underwater beneath his ship. And they're like, you screwed up this time, Pete. And so he ends up serving some time for that. He comes back out, starts smuggling again, but this time he brings on my hero in this whole story, Johnny Schnarr. So Johnny Schnarr is the guy we're going to talk about in a second. But just to sort of wrap up Pete's story a little bit more, at the end of Prohibition in the 1930s, he opens this beauty right here, which was the Northwest Brewing Company. And they were the place that brewed Marinoff beer. And what I love about Pete was he was legit throughout his whole career. When he was smuggling, that's all he did. And then once Prohibition ends and he was like, well, I'm going to stay in the liquor business. And so he starts brewing beer in the area. And it was apparently pretty tasty. People were into it. But he just couldn't escape trouble in his life. So where this is today, that building was eventually demolished, unfortunately. It would have been right here on the corner, which is across from the Almond Roca factory, for those of you who are curious. But he was in competition because the first thing he started brewing was Olympic Club beer, which had the slogan, "It's the beer." And Olympia Brewing, whose slogan was, "It's the water," were very upset about this because they were neighbors and they were in direct competition at a time where like getting set off in the beer industry was very important to everyone again. And so they hit him with a lawsuit and demand that he stops using Olympic beer as his name, and they have to change the slogan. And to be fair, when you look at them side by side, you can tell it wasn't an absurd request. So he changes it to Marinoff beer, a real beer, which I think is the perfect retaliation to this whole thing, and starts brewing all of this beer in the area. And in fact, you can still see an homage to that at the bottom of the McMiniman Elks Temple. Just outside the bottle shop, they have this piece of art down there, which is talking about Prohibition, smuggling in the area, and then eventually Pete Marinoff's transformation from smuggler into legitimate business owner. And that's actually what destroyed him. He was having a series of union strikes hit his brewery. And so eventually a teamster gets shot in a scuffle. And he gets blamed as part of a conspiracy to have this guy assassinated. And whether true or not, the union took it to heart. And so they went after Pete, and he lost everything. He was unable to maintain a business or brewery after that and sort of just vanishes into the history books. No one sees him after that for a long time, but he never does beer or anything in the Tacoma area after that period of time. So it's tragic that he maintains this sophisticated network of people who trusted each other throughout all of Prohibition. And then as soon as things turn legit, he just can't make it happen anymore. But his business associate, Johnny Schnarr, this is his operating territory, basically all throughout the San Juans and those little coves and inlets and dangerous areas that were unmarked. And he is up against the U.S. Coast Guard. Now, that guy that I was telling you about, Captain Lorenz Lonsdale, was the biggest fish in the water at the time, which is ironic because he was 5 feet tall. They called him Granddad, and he was the most feared naval officer in the area, and he used to just destroy smugglers. He had a fleet of well-decked out Coast Guard ships. Basically, these bad boys right here, these were, I think, 75-foot patrol boats. In the late 1920s is when these were really operating throughout the Puget Sound here. And Captain Lorenz was adamant that if their ships were going to be slow, they needed to be heavily armed. And he was notorious for two things. One, being real hard. So if he thought you were smuggling at all, they would be all up on your vessel as soon as they saw you enter the waters. The other thing he was really well known for was that if they could identify you as a smuggler, they would destroy that ship. So they had a series of rapid fire cannons and machine guns just bedazzled on these vessels. And so as soon as the Coast Guard would roll up on a smuggler, if they didn't turn off their engine and he was in a bad mood, they would just fill that whole thing with holes. I think his exact quote was, "I want it to look like a window screen." And he was a no-nonsense guy. And he actually ended up serving in the Puget Sound for his entire career, if I'm not mistaken. But the one guy that he could never catch, his white whale, was this gentleman right here, Johnny Schnarr, the only rum runner and smuggler in the Puget Sound to have never once been captured or arrested. And he designed this boat right here. So to give you some context, at the peak of rum running in the 1920s, a Coast Guard vessel was going to be averaging anywhere from 15 to 20 knots. And a lot of the original boats at the time could do barely that. And so Pete, or Johnny here, was like, you know what? We can do better. And so he was just sort of a tinkerer. He was a self-made engineer, and he had the idea that he would buy secondhand airplane engines from World War I. And so he ends up buying a bunch of these abandoned, I think they were Victory engines, if I'm trying to remember right here, these V12 airplane engines, and he installs anywhere from 2 to 3 in these tiny boats, and developed a proprietary clutch for the entire system, and comes up with essentially what this is, the Sea Sled here. This is actually the inspiration for the Boeing Sea Sled. The speedboats that Johnny was making just for himself to smuggle Canadian liquor down into the United States were so fast, so sleek, and so well built that they're often attributed to being the forerunner of the hydroplane. They think that the American hydroplane was invented based on the Johnny Schnarr design of smuggling boat. And for sure, the Boeing company has admitted that their line of Sea Sled, the fastest in the water, was designed based on his design. And so a few of the Schnarr boats are still out there. I think this is from mid-2000, probably 2010. It's called the Lazy S now. I believe it's still at sea out in the Lake Washington area. It was seen on Mason Lake for a while there, but this was one of the vessels that in 1928 Johnny Schnarr made, and it had these 12 airplane engines inside of it, and his vessels, when fully throttled up, could do anywhere from 55 to 65 knots, with the best Coast Guard vessels in the area at the time being able to do at most 25 knots, he was impossible to catch. Coupled with the fact that he had this incredible intimate knowledge of the Puget Sound. So, you know, even if you saw him, you could never catch him. And you would never see him because he would go through these little coves and hidden passages and do so when there was a heavy storm, a fog bank in the middle of the night, usually only in the fall, late fall or winter was the time that he liked to operate. And he was in these speedboats that were painted all black with no running lights. Guy was a phantom. They never, ever caught him. In the places where he was established, people knew what he was doing. Like, he was one of the sort of folk heroes of the Puget Sound. And there's multiple accounts written and oral about Johnny Schnarr just being sort of the Robin Hood of the area there. But this is a photo of a captured smuggling vessel around the same time period there. And so you could see what the competition was. That one on the right is the captured smuggling vessel. And it couldn't even get close to the speedboats that they had at the time. And in fact, you can see now a lot of that echoed in modern smuggling. So this is the Active. It is the current U.S. Coast Guard vessel that's stationed, I believe, in Port Angeles, but operates in the Puget Sound area. And one of its main tasks is to prevent smuggling or the import of narcotics into the United States. And just off the coast of California, they, maybe last month, confiscated this vessel, which is a narcotics smuggling semi-submersible. This is the thing that they're doing now, where you build something low profile that doesn't show up on radar. You put as much power as you can into the engines and then just run that sucker at night. And I think they've confiscated something like $220 million worth of narcotics trying to be smuggled into the United States on these vessels. And it mirrors almost identically the struggles that the Coast Guard were having with Johnny Schnarr. You see the exact same tactics and boat designs. And so next time you're thinking about smuggling or rum running, know that really the last time there was a major leap in the technology and tactics was in the 1920s here in the Puget Sound with America's own smuggling hero. And this is important because there was a very clear divide between rum runners and smugglers and pirates. Because the other thing that really gets to fever pitch in the 1920s was piracy, where a lot of these rum runners were coming through the area and people that wanted to just make a quick buck would hijack those vessels, or in a lot of cases murder the people that were involved in it. And so legitimate Pete Marinoff ends up being responsible, always following his code, for breaking up a major piracy ring when a Canadian father and son who were bringing liquor out to the ocean to be picked up by one of his guys end up getting murdered by a crew of pirates in the area there. And Pete ends up being the guy who tips off enough information that they find that piracy ring. Because again, in the Puget Sound, they had the understanding that fighting prohibition through smuggling and rum running was one thing, but committing violence against other people wasn't allowed. Like, it was the universal code for the most part throughout the smugglers in the Puget Sound. And that was something that they tried to stick to because they were already dealing with enough dangers. When Canada ends up getting squeezed by the United States, it was like, please stop selling alcohol to these guys. They had to make the decision to give it all up. And so the Canadian government was like, all right, that's it. We're not exporting liquor to buyers with American anything anymore. And so the export companies that now are about to lose out a bunch of money created motherships, is what they were called. They were floating warehouses that were right on the border between Canada and US waters. And they would just anchor them out at sea. And then these rum runners would roll up in the middle of the night with a prearranged contract. People like Roy Olmsted back in Seattle or Pete Marinoff in Tacoma would put in their orders and then write down an order number and then send it through a secret signal up to Canada. And then they would pay for it with a batch of money that they would essentially ship up there with a torn $1 bill with that serial number on there. Then the rum runner would have to show up in the middle of the night to pick up the shipment and present the other half of that dollar bill. And if the torn edges fit perfectly, they could pick up the delivery and then smuggle it back down into the US. So they had this whole sophisticated system of who could get what. But once they got here, the tricky part was how to get it from cover of darkness on the water into the city itself. And that's where the hatch becomes super important. So you could hide opium or alcohol in other products. For example, large wheat sacks in a massive warehouse out here. But getting it secretly in there without customs officials noticing it became the real challenge. So if you had a secret hatch cut out of the floorboards of, for example, your warehouse, now your Seaport Museum, you could bring stuff up in and bring it around. The other thing that they would do is find hiding caches throughout the area. So up on Lummi Island is today, it's called Smugglers Cove. And the Lummi Island Heritage Society has a whole series on places that they're trying to preserve. And they've got this quick video I want to show you of Smugglers Cove, just so you can see out there.
And my memories of Smugglers Cove were kind of similar in that it was two abandoned cabins, or we knew they weren't abandoned, they belonged to somebody. And they had you could see through the windows that there were possessions inside, and it meant something to somebody. And when something means something to somebody, it means something to you. And there's a lot of people, getting older now, that place means something to us. And we want it to continue to mean something to people. And so, if it can be preserved, it'll mean a lot to us.
So, Smugglers Cove becomes one of the cache points throughout the Puget Sound. Any place where they could find a guarded area to stash stuff before they brought it down to Seattle or Tacoma, that's what they would do. And then when they got it here, they had to find a place to weave it into the city. So when you're looking at the Foss Seaport Museum, it's right beneath Old City Hall. It's right on the railroad, and it's right where Chinatown used to be. So here's an aerial shot that sort of pans across, and you can see where the rail yard is today. It used to be all of Chinatown, and that area was connected to the rest of the city and to the gulches. So take a look here. So there's the Seaport Museum on the left. You can see Old City Hall and the McMinimans Elks building right there. And then this area where Chinatown used to be, you could actually take something up through that hatch in the bottom of the Seaport Museum, stash it there, and then bring it through any of these points up through these gulches into the city itself. And you could do that through this series of tunnels there, because a lot of the tunnels that had steam pipe access emptied out onto this section here, which is now 705. And let me give you a couple glances at those tunnels here in the area. So again, this is the hatch that comes up into the Seaport Museum itself. And then if you're looking, so this is the University of Washington Tacoma campus as it was back in the 1920s. And it's essentially looking, if you're looking down this direction, it connects to that base where the Seaport Museum is. And you could run all through these tunnel systems there. So if you Otter, which is kind of in the midway point between University of Washington Tacoma and the Seaport Museum, had a known speakeasy in the back and was connected through an underground passage like this from the Seaport section down into the rest of the city. And directly across the street is one of the places that was known as a speakeasy throughout all of history. It was under the Hotel Olympus. For a while there, it was called the Mirror Room. I think that's what people most commonly associate it with. This is what it looks like today, but it was connected through a series of underground passages as well to those steam tunnels. And so if you were to bring something up from the Seaport, you could then distribute it all throughout Pacific Avenue, or at the time, Whiskey Row. And when you're looking through that area, only some of that underground section still remains. So this is from underground, I think 2 blocks closer to the water from the actual Whiskey Row section. And it's part of that underground vaulted chamber as well. And you'll still see some remnants of stuff that had been trafficked through that area there, because it's really just an untouched, forgotten about portion of the city of Tacoma. Like when you're looking at this one here, most of these places are just used as unofficial storage underneath the businesses that are up on the street level today. And they were all connected either through like that shadow network or physically connected to places that were either selling it or storing it. The most places, so this is actually a still operation that got busted in the 1920s, where to be a part of that underground network, people were digging underneath their business or their home and then having secret passageways lead down into that section right there. When you're looking at Tacoma today, the things that you should be looking for, and you can still see a few of them in downtown, are the glass blocks on the sidewalk. And there's so few of them left because as the city modernizes, they get rid of those. But those used to be part of a skylight system that let light down into the underground passages there. So if you're ever on the west side of a building and there's glass section on the sidewalk there, you know that it's part of that tunnel system that used to run underground there. Also, if you can find 2 small manhole covers, there's a pretty standard size that are used for manhole covers today. And if you can find some that are smaller, like a little bit larger than a dinner plate, I'd say, that are kitty corner to each other, about 6 feet apart, sort of like the 2 on a die, that is part of an access system into the underground part of Tacoma as well. Because what they would do is they would have a worker get lowered down through one, and then on a counter system, they would lower like a bucket of equipment down through the other hole, and they would just have a tripod system on top act as the counter system. So being able to recognize those 2 things can give you some clues. But the best way to sort of start a walking investigation of it is to go to essentially the corner where Old City Hall is, South 7th and Pacific Avenue, and then you're positioned right above the Foss Waterway Seaport with its secret hatch, and then the distribution line underground on the sidewalks all throughout Pacific Avenue. For that, I think we're going to leave it there. I think I could talk about smugglers and run runners throughout the area for a long time there, but I really just wanted to give you guys a grasp on the scope of how much happened and really how much of it came directly through a building that we still have down there on the waterfront today. There are few examples so clear and well preserved as the ones we have of that hatch down there, of people being able to get their contraband into the city. Also, I just love that they staged these shots. So if you guys have questions, comments, please let me know. If not, I will see you guys very soon. We have a series of virtual tours coming up, and we will be continuing our program with the Foss Waterway Seaport of the free virtual Thursdays. Thank you so much. I'll see you guys soon. Keep on exploring.